Thank you so much for the invitation to join you today to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion in matters related to academic integrity and student conduct. I'm joining you today from Treaty 7 territory, where I make my home in the city of Calgary, and I wish to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples for whom this is their ancestral territories, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation. You'll see me looking over on my second screen, which is where my slides are being shared from today. I would also like to acknowledge that my home city of the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. In our time together today, we'll talk about academic integrity. That's sort of my area of research and expertise. We'll talk about these, how it's situated from a values perspective, the fundamental values. We'll look at a multi-stakeholder approach to academic integrity that challenges historical approaches that pit students against teachers, students against their institutions, and sometimes even educators against their institutions, and look at updated ways of viewing academic integrity through a multi-stakeholder lens that focuses more on student success. And then finally, we'll look at questions related to equity, diversity, and inclusion, why these are important with regards to academic integrity, what conversations we're not having, what conversations we could be having that we're not having currently. Throughout the session today, I invite you to connect with me during the chat. I have the text chat open on my screen, and I'm happy to address questions as they come up. We also have time at the end of our session for questions and discussion. One of the things that would help me is if you let me know why you're joining the session today through engaging in a chat box. What brought you here, and what questions do you have that we might be able to incorporate into the discussion as we go through all of the materials today. And just in the interest of transparency, I have presented some of this content previously. Academic integrity is often situated as around a key set of fundamental values. These were first initiated through the International Center for Academic Integrity, through one of the founders, Don McCabe, who's since passed away. And they started with 5 fundamental values and then added the 6th one of courage, which is now seen as a key foundational value here. So these are courage, honesty, respect, responsibility, and trust. Often these values are framed in terms of student responsibility. So it is the student's responsibility to act with honesty. It is the student's responsibility to trust that they will be treated fairly in a case of an academic misconduct investigation, for example, and that they will have respect for their professors, and professors will have respect for them. There have been challenges to this framework because some of these values are now being seen as not only to be upheld by students, but to be upheld by everyone in the academic community. And others have proposed that additional values be added to be more inclusive of notions around equity in particular, as well as inclusion. I always like to take a pause here because this framework around values is not absolute. So with regards, for example, to responsibility, this is often framed as students have a responsibility to act honestly, to not cheat, etc. But there can be some nuances and some complexities around these values that I think are worth unpacking. And this framework can serve as a useful point of departure to have productive conversations with students about what do they believe when they think about academic integrity. And I would say academic integrity is about more than the absence of misconduct. And when we incorporate the language of integrity into our classes and into our conversations with students, we want to be careful not to use academic integrity as a euphemism or a substitute for academic misconduct. So when I hear people say, oh, I'm dealing with a case of integrity, like, no, you're not. You might be dealing with a breach of integrity or a violation of integrity. Integrity is something to be encouraged, upheld, and promoted. It's when we deal with breaches or violations of integrity that we're talking about acts of misconduct. And I just wanted to highlight one of these values as an example of some of the nuances and how we can unpack some of the complexities around this. For example, I mentioned responsibility. It's the student's responsibility to not cheat, to act honestly, etc. However, sometimes students can have other responsibilities that aren't well reflected in this framework. For example, students may have responsibilities to peer groups to help them and support them with their learning and support them in different ways. Sometimes in conversations with my peers, this can lead to conversations around stereotyping students from particular places or particular cultures and saying, oh, students from this culture, they always share and help each other, and they help each other cheat on exams. However, when we dig into some of the history around academic integrity, we find that sharing behaviors are actually common across many cultures, including what could be stereotyped as white North American culture. Dating back more than 50 years, there's a pretty strong culture of student sharing in American sororities and fraternities. There's a pejorative term called frat files that basically dates back to even the 1940s and 50s. We find evidence of this, where students were sharing files that at the time were paper files stored in cardboard boxes, often in the basement or some other room of a fraternity or sorority house. Members would be expected to add their own tests, essays, and lab books to these physical files as a way of contributing back to their community and helping their fellow members, even those who came after they graduated, with their future assignments. This was an early form of file sharing, an analog form of file sharing that was alive and well among middle class and upper class white students in the United States. So in other words, academic file sharing did not start during the pandemic, and it did not start during the internet, and in fact was very much alive and well. And I don't share this example in any way to disparage Greek societies, because I know that they also do an awful lot of good, but merely to highlight that the practice of student file sharing is not restricted to students from a particular country, and nor is it something that simply emerged during the age of the internet. So when we're talking about students helping one another and sharing with the purpose of helping them benefit their learning, there are important conversations to be had about the ways in which students can share ethically and what that means to us. And so I present this here only to highlight that these values, again, are not absolute, but can provide a really interesting place to kind of tease out some of these values with students in our conversations with them. Feel free, by the way, to take screenshots of any of my slides. I have shared the final slide deck with Dr. Usman, and she has my permission to share it with you after the session today. In the meantime, if there's anything you'd like to take a screen grab of, please feel free to go ahead. I regularly share my slides. Also, you're welcome to post them on social media or share them out if there's something that you find particularly helpful during today's session. Historically, when it comes to academic integrity and its breaches, the relationships between students and educators have long been adversarial and antagonistic. And so there have been a number of us over the past 20 years or so that have been advocating for more inclusive approaches to academic integrity, in which students hold responsibilities for upholding integrity, but so do faculty members, staff, administration, and community stakeholders. This in no way absolves students of their responsibility to act with honesty and integrity, but instead layers on transparent expectations for others in our learning community to also act with integrity. So for example, when I heard incidences during the COVID-19 pandemic of fellow educators posting fake answers on commercial file sharing sites for the purposes of catching cheaters, I find this to be an unethical act on the part of educators. And so one of the key messages here is that if we expect students to act with integrity, then it's up to us as educators and administrators to set the stage for that and model that behavior. Now, this doesn't mean that we're all walking around with halos, and that that is, by the way, a cultural reference from my own background, and that we never commit any mistakes or we never commit any misconduct, but rather that we're modeling the behavior and holding ourselves as educators to the same standard or higher that we expect our students to engage in. When we put academic integrity together with academic misconduct, we can see a kind of continuum. And on the right-hand side, we can see what we would generally like to refer to as academic integrity around education, skill building, communication of expectations, and so forth. This is, for me, where the teaching and learning aspects of academic integrity come in, giving students lots of opportunity to practice skills related to integrity, not assuming that they know that things related to citing and referencing, for example, challenging outdated assumptions and incorrect assumptions, that students have all of the skills that they need when they come to their first year of university, We know that whether that high school was across the street or across the ocean, that students generally lack sufficient preparation for citing and references for their first year experiences at colleges and universities. This is common around the world. And so providing students with lots of opportunities for formative feedback and to practice these skills will help them to build their academic integrity. And also, there's an increasing push towards understanding academic integrity as ethical decision-making and the foundation for ethical decision-making in everyday life and also for workplace behavior. So in other words, the skills that we learn and the ethical decision-making that we practice as part of our daily behavior is skills that students can carry forward with them into their professional lives after they've completed their studies. However, we know that breaches of integrity can happen. That moment of a breach or a suspected breach is indicated by the vertical line in the middle of the continuum, and that can trigger a misconduct investigation or the opening of a case that would be managed, in our case at the University of Calgary, by an associate dean. Cases are managed in different ways at different universities across Canada, but we do uphold what we call the principles of natural justice and fairness, and that students need to know that a case has been brought against them. They have the right to know what the evidence is, and the person who hears the case must decide the outcome. So again, for us, it's often an associate dean or a director at the University of Calgary. There can be a lot of gray area at that moment that there's a breach. So in other words, the educator may think that there's been a breach and may not be sure. And this is where our policies and procedures can help our academic staff to follow procedures directly at the University of Calgary. There is a process for these cases to be reported up to an administrator rather than cases to be dealt with what we call an idiosyncratic manner or by an individual educator. There can be a lot of stress involved for all parties during this stage. It can be also very stressful for students. And we have resources on campus to help support our students during this time. And we also are acknowledging more and more the stress that can come from staff members, individual academic staff members and other staff members who may experience lots of stress during this time and not knowing what to do, how the case is managed, what the repercussions might be for students or for themselves. It can be a very much a time of uncertainty, but we have lots of supports in place to manage this. But just acknowledging that this is not a black and white kind of situation. There's a lot of uncertainty and gray area here, and that we have processes, policies, procedures in place to help ensure that cases are managed in a way that is fair for all parties involved. Thank you very much. I see Jeff is here as the student ombuds to help with some of the support and help ensuring that students understand what the process and policies are. In some places in the world, plagiarism is a criminal offense. And so if a person is found responsible of plagiarism, there can be jail time or fines. That's not the case in Canada at any Canadian universities, but students can come with a lot of misunderstandings around expectations about what this means for them and what the implications for them might be. So approaching this with a certain amount of sensitivity, I think, can be helpful. The cases do need to be managed and addressed, but there's lots of ways to do it humanely. And in some of the literature around sort of cheating generally, there's a book I really like by a woman named Deborah Rhodey out of the United States, and the title of her book is simply Cheating. She talks about all kinds of cheating, from financial fraud to infidelity in romantic relationships to academic cheating. And she presents the notion of this bell curve of cheating. She doesn't have a figure or a graphic in her book, so I've adapted it here. But she basically talks about one end of a continuum is there are people who will never cheat, a small percentage of the population. And then at the other end of the continuum are what we might call serial cheaters and people who will consistently engage in cheating behaviors or fraudulent behaviors, and nothing we do will help that. But in the middle, about 80 to 90% of people may engage in some cheating behavior some of the time. And, for example, if you've ever run a stop sign, or you've ever exceeded the speed limit, these would be minor infractions that might fall in there. There's parallel kind of minor infractions for student conduct, not citing and referencing properly, those kinds of things. But the percentage of people who intentionally and repeatedly cheat, if we look at a normal bell curve, is actually quite small. So this is kind of the reality of what we're dealing with. However, often when I talk with people who are unfamiliar with academic integrity research and literature, they sometimes think that people who do not cheat are over at the one side of the bell curve, and everybody else is always engaging in cheating behaviors all the time, and that they're doing so intentionally, and it's not actually the case. So challenging some of these I guess, misunderstandings about what does it mean to engage in academic misconduct. In most of the work that I do, I don't actually use the word cheating because cheating implies intention. Whereas in my work, I've seen so many missteps. And I appreciate language that's being used in countries such as Ireland now, where they talk about academic impropriety and academic missteps, because taking the intentionality out of it can actually help students to move forward in their studies. And here's probably an interesting place for me to pause and contemplate some of the complexities in my own field of research. There's a researcher who's passed away now, Tracy Bertag. She was from Australia. And before she died, one of the last pieces that she wrote was sort of a reflection on 15 years of research. And she wrote about something that was kind of mind-blowing for me, and talked about how words like academic dishonesty and academic cheating are used a lot in the United States. And there's a kind of a historical tradition in the United States of things like honor codes and academic cheating really being grounded in things like character education and morality. Whereas in Australia, and arguably in other Commonwealth countries, it's seen as a behavioral issue. And we talk a lot less about morality here and character education. This really struck me, these cultural differences in how we describe student misconduct in mainly English-speaking countries, because it's a lot easier to correct behavior than it is to correct immorality or amorality. And so I would argue that in Canada, we sort of have a bit of a mix because we're so heavily influenced by the United States. However, even the ways in which we're addressing this through policies can itself be influenced by culture. And this kind of takes us into the depth of some of the conversation today around academic integrity and student conduct. These are often neglected concepts, specifically in academic integrity. In the research, we find it addressed more openly in other kinds of student conduct, so non-academic student conduct issues, things like bullying, fighting, those kinds of things. But when it comes to breaches of academic integrity, this is not discussed as much in our literature, with the exception being some discourse around students for whom English is an additional language. So people who work as instructors in that field have written about it in terms of plagiarism. But the way that these concepts are addressed and unpacked largely in our field and enacted through policy and procedure has largely been neglected. So I'll talk about some of the research that we do have and what we're starting to pay attention to in my field. We have found that there is a high risk of negative bias and racism when we talk about international students and academic misconduct. A couple of years ago, my colleague Amy Burns and I in the Workland School of Education wrote a paper in which we contended that the term international student, when used in the context of academic misconduct, is sometimes a euphemism for students who are not white and for whom English is not their first language. So if I say to you, academic misconduct and international student, you're probably not going to think of a white American student for whom English is their first language, even though that student would be an international student. International student is a specific term used for students with a certain kind of study permit when they come to Canada, as I expect many of you already know. However, this particular term is often used as a euphemism for cheating students. So even when I am talking with other people in my own field, I challenge them when I hear things about international students and cheating. I'm like, what do you mean? And I take a little pause and ask, what do you mean when you say international student? And then they may unpack it and identify it as students from a particular region, culture, country, those kinds of things. However, for more than 15 years, scholars have been pushing us to reconsider this. And this quotation from Betty Leask is one that I found impacted me a lot. And when she talks about students from other cultures, frequently being highlighted as perpetrators of this crime against the academic community of enlightened Western scholars. This continues to be an approach that it is perpetuated, I find, particularly in English-speaking institutions, and these are historical norms that are worth challenging and a discourse that's worth disrupting. And I have had colleagues challenge me and say, well, international students or students from other cultures engage in more cheating. What the research shows is that is actually a myth. In research studies that have been conducted, international and domestic students have actually been found to cheat at about the same rates or engage in misconduct at about the same rates. This is based on a large-scale study out of Australia. And interestingly, I just found there was a small-scale study done right here in Calgary, for which I heard the results of last week. It was conducted at Bow Valley College with more than 900 students from the college taking part. They found more domestic students self-reported engaging in academic misconduct than international students. So I'll just repeat that again because it's not written down on the slide and let it sink in. In a very recent 2022 study conducted right here in Alberta, more domestic students self-reported engaging in academic misconduct than their international peers. However, when we look at who's getting reported for academic misconduct, there are studies that have shown that international students, this was a US-based study, international student was not defined in the study as being students with a particular study permit, so that term is complicated. However, they were 4 or 5 times more likely to get reported for academic misconduct than domestic peers. So I'll take a little pause there because I think this is worth unpacking. We need to ask ourselves who's getting reported versus who's getting forgiven without ever being reported, who's getting surveilled without ever being reported. In this particular study, Beasley, he contended that perhaps faculty are conditioned to surveil, in particular, students of color differently than they surveil white students or pay attention to white students, and might be on the lookout for academic misconduct more in students of particular groups. In other words, if you're looking for something, you might find it if you're only paying attention to it within one particular group. With regards to gender, the jury's out. There was a time when studies showed that men engaged in more academic cheating. That was the same time when universities had more men enrolled in them than they did women. And as we found, women, men, and persons of all genders, and those who prefer not to identify with a particular gender, increasing in population in universities and post-secondaries, we have found as well that this idea that men cheat more than women to be flawed and challenged. There's very little data yet beyond the 2 binary genders anywhere in the world. We're starting to get there. But what we have found consistently is that men are more likely to be reported than women for misconduct. So if we compound these factors, what we are finding from other countries is that men who are students of color, for whom English is an additional language, are much more likely than women who are white, for whom English is a first language, to be reported for plagiarism, exam cheating, and other kinds of academic misconduct. However, these studies are all from other countries. The ones that you see on the slide here, the one from me, it was a synthesis. I didn't collect empirical data for it. The ones where they collected empirical data, it's from Australia, the US, and some from the UK. We have no data on these kinds of statistics for Canada yet. So all that we know, we're relying on from other countries. But there's every reason to believe that what is happening elsewhere is probably also happening in Canada as well. This study, recent study from Mary Davis out of the UK, showed that students who were disproportionately reported for misconduct included racialized minority students from Asia and Africa. Particularly from Asia, she identified that students from China, India, and Pakistan were more likely than students from any other country to be reported for misconduct. This does not mean that students from those countries are committing more misconduct necessarily, but rather that they're being identified and going through the misconduct process compared with students who were white, and in that case, born in the UK. That's where that study was conducted. A similar study from a different university, the Open University of the UK, this was an institutional study, showed that Black students were 22 times more likely to be flagged for potential fraud. I'll just let that sink in. That Black students were 22 times more likely than their white peers to be flagged for potential fraud. In this case, fraud was not clearly defined, but we can imagine that it would include various kinds of academic fraud, as this was a UK institutional study that was done. These things signal to us that there is very likely overrepresentation of individuals from particular equity-deserving groups that are being reported for misconduct. Interestingly, a couple of different studies from the United States were able to link this to student retention and found that international students, again, ill-defined, but presumably meaning foreign-born students, were less likely to be retained than domestic students following a finding of academic misconduct. I found this particularly troubling in the work that I do. Because what we know from some of the academic misconduct is that the conduct process itself can be incredibly stressful and can lead to mental health concerns, and students may require additional support. They may or may not engage in help-seeking behaviors around that. And with regards to withdrawal rates, there's almost no data that we have in Canada that would link with rates of withdrawal to misconduct cases. And in particular, if there's an international student who's been found responsible of misconduct, that what the outcomes are in terms of them being retained by the university. We have almost no information. So the lack of data that we have is quite troubling. And there's an awful lot of work that I think we need to do in Canada at our individual institutions if we're going to look at student support and the student experience to ensure that all of our students are properly supported for all of their success. And you may have heard me throughout this presentation using particular words and avoiding particular words. For example, one of the words, I try to avoid as much legalistic language when I talk about academic integrity as possible. For example, we hold students responsible for the behavior. We don't use words at the University of Calgary such as guilt or guilty. In fact, if you study policy and procedure around this, you can look at all of our policies and procedures at the University of Calgary, and you will not find the words guilt or guilty or charged. Instead, you will find us using language such as holding individuals responsible for the behavior. This is intended and it's purposeful to signal that we're all responsible for our conduct. And if there's been a misstep, that there can be a process in place to move forward from that. So we don't use words such as punishment. We do use language such as sanctions. Sanctions can be educational. For example, our Student Success Center offers a number of educational outcomes or consequences for students to give them an opportunity to learn. But in terms of student retention, there's, I think, a lot of questions that we still need to ask about including students, including we are supporting students through all of the misconduct and beyond the misconduct finding. Until recently, academic integrity has sort of been viewed through three lenses, with one being the morality lens. This was particularly prominent in the United States up until about, say, the 1950s and 60s, during the time of civil and social unrest on American campuses. And students began protesting. And before that, there was a lot of things like handbooks and rule books around student conduct and what was allowed, what was not allowed, and the kinds of punishments students could receive if they broke the rules, those sorts of things. During the 1960s, American students wanted the right to protest on their campuses. And I'll just quickly summarize without going into a lot of detail. So there were some legal cases that were brought forward in American universities in around that time. Universities were relieved of what was called the in loco parentis function of universities. In other words, universities could not act in place of parents and punish students for their behavior, engaging in behavior control, those kinds of things. What that led to was the development of policies and procedures. So before that, there were regulations, guidebooks, those kinds of things. But in terms of policy, this is actually relatively new in terms of the last 50 years. When you think about the whole history of universities, this is a relatively recent development. And so policy studies around this have evolved, certainly during my lifetime. And then around the beginning of the 20th century, there was a further push to include a teaching and learning focus around academic integrity, including things like student supports, giving formative assessment, and ensuring students had lots of chance to build and practice skills that would help them uphold integrity. And then this year, I've proposed layering on an additional piece to this framework, which is around equity and advocacy. We cannot ignore these questions any longer. With regards to academic integrity, because there are so many equity issues we have yet to confront in this field. So in particular, I'll give us lots of time for discussion and questions today. So some questions you might want to take forward and engage with your colleagues and others at your own institution would be, who's getting reported versus who's getting forgiven without ever being reported? And we know that there's not all professors will report student academic misconduct. But if we're looking at who will get reported and under what circumstances, ensuring that that's equitable and that consequences are equitable across different groups of students. There's some evidence to suggest that students of color or students from equity deserving groups sometimes get harsher punishments than white English speaking peers. Again, the lack of data is pretty troubling here. And also asking questions around how students from equity deserving groups are being supported with their learning, for example, from orientation tutorials to skill building workshops, etc., and avoiding or resisting assumptions that students come to campus with all of the skills that they need to be successful here. And how are we offering educational supports either instead of or in addition to punitive sanctions? I can say that at other universities across Canada and elsewhere, probably with Grant MacEwan being one of the exemplars of excellence that we have in Canada, now restorative practices are often being used to address issues related to academic misconduct. We're not quite there at the University of Calgary yet, but the conversations are starting in the ways that we can, instead of using what they call progressive discipline, that with subsequent offenses might have students ejected or expelled or excluded from the university, instead asking how do we keep students as part of our community and ensure their success through their entire learning journey with us. And how do we track these student retention rates as they relate to misconduct cases? We could probably add in here as well. How do we track data related to student wellness and well-being with regards to academic misconduct? There is research to show stress factors can trigger or be a cause of misconduct, but very little research having been done about what is the effect or impact of an accusation or allegation of misconduct on student mental well-being. Very little data anywhere in the world on that, but important questions to ask. So just as kind of getting ready to wrap up here, looking at academic integrity as about being more than the absence of misconduct, but rather an ethical framework for decision-making in and beyond our classrooms to everyday life and in the workplace. And more, we're starting to see this not only as a matter of avoiding cheating or not plagiarizing and something beyond the classroom, but rather looking at ethical decision-making as part of our hidden curriculum or embedded in our curriculum. And to constantly be challenging ourselves and others to avoid othering when we're looking at academic integrity questions, and advocating for the collection of more data in order to support student learning and support equity. And so kind of the key takeaway here for me is there can be no integrity without equity. The word integrity itself comes from a Latin root and it means to make whole. So if you think about the word integrate, that comes from the same root. For integrating, we are making whole. So when we focus on integrity, we must focus on wholeness and completeness, and we can't have that without equity. And so this is effectively a key issue. Equity, diversity, inclusion, decolonization, indigenization, these are key issues when it comes to academic integrity. This is about more than student conduct or simply avoiding behaviors that can result in severe consequences. So I'll just wrap up my slides today with a brief conclusion about how we make dozens of decisions every day, and that these will challenge us to be ethical in small or big ways. It's the same with academic integrity, other forms of student conduct, and also decisions beyond our classroom. And so there are implications for us as educators, and there's probably a larger conversation than we have time to get into today about the impact around things like microaggressions in classrooms, and how when microaggressions are committed by educators, that this means that educators themselves are not acting with integrity. So ethical decision making is not only something I think that we can expect from our students, but also need to insist upon from our educational peers, administrators, and other staff members on campus. If we think about that wraparound approach to student success, then modeling integrity must start with those who are in the in leadership positions, whether it's in the classroom or in the institution. And again, that kind of wrap up key messages: there can be no integrity without equity.